Well, thrilled to be joined now by editor-at-large at the Wall Street Journal and great friend of this show, Gerard Baker. Gerard, thanks for joining me here. I want to start out here by talking about the media in the U.S. right now, and specifically what is going on at CBS. Now, they've recently brought in Bari Weiss to run their news division, but the New York Post has just reported that she now has to have a suite of bodyguards traveling with her now because apparently free speech in America is such that if you question the leftist narrative or upset it all, you could wind up being in some sort of physical harm. And it brings me to a great piece you've got in the Wall Street Journal this week where you talk about the broader problem with the media and the sheer horizontal and vertical reach of the progressive mindset in newsrooms. The entrenched nature of their ideological skew will militate against a successful resetting of their compass. How big a challenge, and I think that sums it up, but how big a challenge is Bari Weiss and anybody else who wants to see fairness in the American media up against?
Well, good to see you again, James. Look, I thank you very much for referencing the column. The problem with the American media, and I think it's very much the same in Australia, I know it's the same in the UK too, is not something that can be fixed by just changing the people at the top, by just ordering, someone even with great power and great talent, as Bari Weiss, I must say, has, just ordering people to do journalism differently. It doesn't work like that. These institutions are absolutely crawling with people of a particular progressive liberal mindset. They go into journalism for that reason. They go into journalism because they kind of lean in that direction. They take over, or rather they're recruited into these large media organizations where they basically all agree with each other on all the important issues of the day. That's an entrenched situation in pretty well every major newsroom. There are some exceptions, and indeed the only way you get an exception is by actively repopulating a news organization so that it does move in a different direction. Otherwise, the natural direction of these places is to go like that. So again, while I applaud what's going on in the American media, we've seen it with, as you said, Bari Weiss taking over at CBS. Jeff Bezos is trying to make some important changes at the Washington Post. There are some other indications that maybe other news organizations have finally woken up to the sort of woke progressive crowd and just how damaging it is. They've got an incredible task ahead of them because it's not just enough, as I say, to change the person at the top. They've got to change the people. They've got to change the culture. It's a social problem as much as anything, James. And I just don't see these institutions changing very quickly, very soon.
Well, we have the Australian Broadcasting Corporation here, which is like the BBC, and it's often called like a staff-run collective. And when we put conservatives onto the board there, it makes very little difference. And I'm wondering how much of this is really, as you say, cultural. Does this need to actually be a whole of society effort that universities need to start, being more diverse in their ideological outlook? Because I think, about 95% probably of professors in most disciplines vote Democrat now, right?
Yeah, and it's got worse over the last 20, 30 years. Exactly right, James. And the numbers we've seen actually are precisely in line with what you mentioned. Yes, it does require a much broader social change. I also wonder a little bit, look, I think there is a kind of natural selection, if I may sort of misuse that Darwinian term
Sure.
a little bit, that goes on here, because I think people who are sort of concerned, people who want to make money, people who want to go into business, people who are entrepreneurs, who believe in free markets because they're going to thrive in free markets, they tend to be conservative. They tend to go and do that very thing. They tend to go and be entrepreneurs, make money, go into business and do well for themselves. And I speak very much, very self-aware here as I say this. People who maybe don't want to do that, don't have that interest, and actually, are more interested in, if you like, criticizing and analyzing and commenting. They tend more to be on the left. They don't have the wherewithal, the talent, the interest, the initiative to go into business, and they don't tend to be conservative, and they end up running, working for the ABC or the BBC or pretty well every major media organization here in the US. So things can change, certainly. You're right about universities, but I do also think there probably just is again, an almost natural process by which people, what's the old phrase we had in England, he who can does, he who cannot teaches. Well, I think, the phrase, he who can does, he who cannot reports on it.
Well, yes, indeed, indeed. Hey, you're in New York City right now, and I want to just talk and just indulge me on this for a moment because I've been absolutely fascinated by the Zoran Mamdani campaign here and the atmospherics that are there. Just tell us a little bit about what it's like there because I spoke earlier in the program about this Canal Street cleanup. Now, Canal Street has that huge sort of open air market of, fake handbags and all that sort of thing. New Yorkers, at least some, seem to be very annoyed that the feds cleaned that up. What is happening on the streets? What's happening in New York that, there's this great sort of engine of capitalism has become enthralled to this Democrat socialist?
Well, James, from the times you've been here, New York City is a mess. It's still a great city. Reasonable claim to be one of the greatest cities in the world, if not the greatest city in the world. It has incredible, arts and entertainment. It has tremendous economic dynamism, still the sort of financial capital of the world. There's all those things going for it. But it's a mess. The city is a mess. The number of homeless people is shocking. The crime, well, not as bad as it was back in the 1990s, and I remember that period well. It's still bad. It's still bad. The streets are filled with rats and the sort of sweet, pungent smell of urine pretty well everywhere. There is, and if it's not urine, it's weed. And as you say, there's crime. There's tremendous number of illegal immigrants, which previous administrations have allowed in to the country and housed in hotels at great expense. It is a mess. It's an enormous mess. And I think one of the, whether it's ICE doing what they were doing, and as you say, remember what you have here is a population that has essentially luxury beliefs, right? These are for the most part, the people who object to ICE doing their job or law enforcement doing its job generally are people who are not really affected by crime or homelessness or the sheer unpleasantness of the streets. They drive around, they're driven around in limousines or, they live in parts of town where they never have to see these things. And they're happy to, of course, continue to vote for, liberal leaders like this guy Mamdani, that the socialist leader we're going to get like this guy Mamdani, that we're almost certainly going to get elected in a couple of weeks. And they don't have to do, because they don't actually see the problems. And I think that's the peril with so many of these of cities like New York, London, where I've just been in London. London is much the same. It is, there are many urban problems, but they have a kind of political culture whereby those people, again, who don't really have to face those urban problems, are kind of, happy to continue to inflict them on the people who do have to deal with them by continuing to vote in left-wing political leaders.
Yeah, no, look, I lived there in the 1990s myself. I remember how bad it was and how good it was when Rudy Giuliani finally started to clean up the mess. Hey, finally, I just want to talk about a bit of foreign policy here with you, too. And I thought this was very interesting, this intervention that Vice President J.D. Vance made into a vote in Israel's Knesset where they were talking about annexing the West Bank. Here's a little bit of J.D. Vance.
When I asked about it, somebody told me that it was a political stunt, that it had no practical significance. It was purely symbolic. I mean, look, if it was a political stunt, it was a very stupid political stunt, and I personally take some insult to it. The West Bank is not going to be annexed by Israel. The policy of the Trump administration is that the West Bank will not be annexed by Israel. That will continue to be our policy. And if people want to take symbolic votes, they can do that. But we certainly weren't happy about it.
Just quickly here, does this show that there's a bit of impatience with Israel on their side of the peace deal and the ceasefire?
Yeah, there is a little bit. I mean, we've seen this with Trump. Trump was very unhappy with Netanyahu's attack on Doha, on Qatar, the failed attempt to kill Hamas leaders there a few weeks ago. That, I think, accelerated the peace process and certainly pushed Trump towards getting more actively involved and getting that done. He doesn't like this talk. Now, this, to be fair, is these sort of religious parties in Israel, who claim that the West Bank is Judea and Samaria, and they want to reclaim it for Jews and for Israel. And as Vance says, that's not going to happen. There is impatience, but at the same time, there's also an awareness here that, look, the Israelis did agree to that ceasefire. What you're seeing is violence, continued violence, carrying on in Gaza, in Palestine, led by Hamas. And so there's continuing support for Israel. There's no question. I think Donald Trump is probably the most pro-Israel leader that the United States has had for at least 50 years. So there's no question that there is that support there. But at the same time, they don't want to see what J.D. Vance rightly calls stunts like this, which could damage the peace process. Look, above all else, Trump wants there to be peace. He wants the fighting to end. You know, another notch on his belt in the campaign for the Nobel Peace Prize.
Absolutely.
And anything that makes that more difficult, he's going to oppose.
Absolutely right, Gerard Baker. Thank you so much for your time as always.